Welcome to War Archives Black. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like to stay inside the operation.
Operation Puppet Mind, the secret science of indoctrinating youth. On a Tuesday morning in September 1941, a teacher in Berlin opened a package that had arrived from the Ministry of Education. Inside were 73 lesson plans, each one numbered, each one approved by the state. The first lesson was titled, The Nature of the Enemy, and it came with charts, with photographs, with questions the children were supposed to answer. By the end of that week, every school in the city would receive the same package, and by the end of that month, every child between the ages of 7 and 14 would have learned the same lessons, absorbed the same ideas, repeated the same phrases until they felt like their own thoughts. This was not education. This was engineering, the systematic construction of belief, the manufacturing of consensus on an industrial scale. The teacher did not question the materials because questioning had become dangerous, and because the lessons seemed reasonable, even necessary given the circumstances. The nation was at war, after all, and children needed to understand what was at stake, needed to know who threatened them and why. What the teacher could not see, what no single teacher could see from inside the system, was that these lessons were not isolated incidents but part of a coordinated operation spanning every institution, every medium, every voice of authority that touched a child's life. The goal was not simply to inform but to transform, to take young minds still forming their understanding of the world and shape them into instruments of state purpose, willing, eager, incapable of doubt. This operation had no single name in the documents, no official designation that revealed its true scope. It was hidden inside ordinary bureaucracy, disguised as curriculum reform, as public health initiatives, as cultural programming. But those who designed it understood exactly what they were building. A system for the mass production of belief, a factory where raw human consciousness entered and ideology emerged, fixed and permanent. The techniques they developed would outlast the regimes that created them, would be studied and refined and deployed again and again because they worked, because they discovered something fundamental about how human minds develop and how that development could be controlled. The science of indoctrinating youth rests on a simple truth that educators and propagandists have understood for centuries but that modern psychology has mapped in precise detail. The human brain between the ages of 5 and 15 is in a critical period of identity formation, when the fundamental frameworks for understanding reality are being constructed. During this window, children are extraordinarily receptive to authority, to pattern, to repetition. They learn not just facts but values, not just information but entire systems of meaning. They absorb the unspoken rules that govern what can be questioned and what must be accepted, what marks someone as belonging and what marks them as other. And most critically, they do all of this without conscious awareness, without the capacity to recognize that what they are learning is not universal truth but constructed narrative. The architects of Operation Puppet Mind, though they never used that name, understood this window of vulnerability and designed their systems to exploit it completely. The operation was not a single program but a web of interlocking mechanisms, each reinforcing the others, each covering the gaps the others left behind. Schools provided the foundational instruction, the explicit lessons that children consciously studied and repeated. Radio filled the spaces between school days, the evenings and weekends when children were supposedly at leisure, their guards lowered, their minds open to stories and songs that felt like entertainment but carried the same ideological payload as the classroom. Posters covered the visual landscape, creating an environment where certain images, certain messages, certain assumptions were inescapable, normalized, part of the basic texture of reality. In the schools, the transformation began with textbooks. Between 1933 and 1939 in Germany, virtually every textbook was rewritten, not just in history and civics but in mathematics, biology, even music. The changes were sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, but always ideological. Mathematics problems asked children to calculate the cost of caring for the mentally ill, to work out how many homes could be built if resources were not wasted on the disabled. Biology lessons focused on racial classification, on the supposed scientific basis for hierarchy among human populations, on the necessity of purifying the national bloodline. History became mythology, a narrative of eternal struggle between pure and corrupted, strong and weak, us and them. The genius of this approach was that children learned these lessons while learning to read, to calculate, to analyze. The ideological content became fused with the development of basic cognitive skills, so that questioning the ideology meant questioning mathematics itself, questioning the ability to think logically, questioning the fundamental tools of reason. By the time a child had finished primary education, the propaganda was not something imposed from outside but the very language of thought, the categories through which all experience was filtered and understood. Teachers were both instruments and targets of this system. Those who resisted were removed, quietly at first, more brutally as the system consolidated. Those who remained were required to attend training sessions where the new methods were explained, demonstrated, practiced until they became automatic. The training emphasized that teachers were not simply conveying information but molding character, shaping the next generation of citizens, performing a sacred duty to the nation. Most teachers genuinely believed this, genuinely saw themselves as doing important, even noble work. They did not recognize that they had become transmission mechanisms for a carefully engineered system of control, that their classrooms had been converted into factories for manufacturing consent. The daily rituals reinforced the lessons constantly. Each morning began with collective affirmation, with pledges and songs that fused individual identity with national purpose. Children learned to begin each day by declaring their loyalty, by participating in synchronized displays of belonging, by experiencing their individuality dissolved into the mass. The psychological effect was profound, creating a rhythm of submission and solidarity that became as natural as breathing, as unquestioned as gravity. The children stood at attention, raised their arms in salute, and felt themselves becoming part of something larger, something that promised meaning and protection in exchange for absolute loyalty. But the schools were only the foundation. Radio extended the reach of indoctrination into the home, into the most private spaces of family life. By 1939, the German government had distributed millions of inexpensive radio receivers, devices designed specifically to receive state broadcasts with maximum clarity while making it difficult to tune to foreign stations. The radios were called people's receivers, and their presence transformed the domestic sphere into an extension of state space, a place where the voice of authority could speak directly, intimately at any hour. The programming for children was carefully calibrated. Adventure serials featured young heroes who demonstrated loyalty, courage, obedience to legitimate authority. The villains were invariably outsiders, foreigners, those who questioned or undermined the social order. The stories were genuinely entertaining, professionally produced with high production values and talented voice actors. Children looked forward to these programs, anticipated them, discussed them with friends. They had no framework for recognizing that the entertainment was instructional, that each episode reinforced specific lessons about who deserved trust and who deserved suspicion, what constituted bravery and what constituted cowardice, when individual judgment should be overridden by collective necessity. The radio also brought music, and music proved to be one of the most powerful tools in the entire system. Songs written specifically for youth movements were broadcast repeatedly, their melodies simple and memorable, their lyrics emphasizing sacrifice, solidarity, readiness for struggle. Children sang these songs in school, in youth organizations, at home with their families. The music created emotional associations that bypassed rational analysis, linking feelings of joy, belonging, and excitement to the symbols and narratives of the state. Years later, survivors would report that they could still remember every word of these songs, that hearing them even decades after the war triggered the same feelings of longing and purpose they had felt as children, despite everything they had since learned and experienced. The posters completed the saturation, filling visual space with messages that became part of the unconscious background of daily life. They appeared on school walls, on street corners, in shops and offices, creating an environment where certain ideas were omnipresent, unavoidable, normalized through sheer repetition. The imagery was carefully designed, employing techniques derived from advertising and psychological research. Strong diagonal compositions created a sense of dynamic movement and progress. Upward-gazing angles made subjects appear heroic, powerful, worthy of emulation. Color schemes were limited and bold, making the posters instantly recognizable, memorable, visually distinct from the ordinary chaos of urban life. The posters did not argue or explain. They asserted, they assumed, they presented ideological positions as self-evident truths requiring no justification. A poster showing a young person in uniform needed no text beyond a simple slogan because the image itself communicated everything. This is what you should aspire to be, this is what health and strength and virtue look like, this is the only form of youth worth recognizing. Over time, through constant exposure, these images shaped aesthetic preferences, created templates for identity, defined what was desirable and what was shameful without ever stating these judgments explicitly. The Soviet Union developed parallel systems with different aesthetics but identical purposes. Soviet schools taught children that the individual existed to serve the collective, that personal desires were bourgeois corruption, that the highest calling was to build socialism through labor and sacrifice. The Young Pioneers organization enrolled children as young as 7, providing uniforms, rituals, a complete social world that reinforced these lessons constantly. Pioneer radio programs featured stories of children informing on counter-revolutionaries, of young workers exceeding production quotas, of students denouncing teachers who expressed doubt about party doctrine. Soviet posters emphasized industrial imagery, showing children and teenagers operating machinery, building infrastructure, participating in the great project of social transformation. The message was clear: you are not children but workers in training, not students but future soldiers in the economic and ideological struggle, not individuals but cells in the collective organism of the state. The visual style was bold and modernist, presenting the future as a gleaming technological paradise that would be achieved through discipline, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to party leadership. In both systems, the indoctrination extended beyond explicit content into the structure of daily life itself. Children were organized into hierarchical groups where performance was constantly monitored and compared. Those who demonstrated proper attitude, who showed enthusiasm for the lessons and activities, who embodied the values being taught received recognition, privileges, opportunities for advancement. Those who hesitated, who asked the wrong questions, who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm were marked as deficient, subject to collective criticism, isolated from their peers. The social dynamics created powerful incentives for conformity, not through crude punishment but through the much more effective mechanism of status and belonging. The peer pressure was often more effective than any explicit teaching. Children learned quickly that fitting in required accepting and repeating the dominant narratives, that skepticism or independent thinking marked one as strange, potentially dangerous, unworthy of trust or friendship. The need to belong, to be accepted, to have social standing is one of the most powerful drives in human psychology, especially during adolescence. The system weaponized this need, making ideological conformity the price of social survival. The youth organizations were particularly effective because they provided genuine community, genuine adventure, genuine opportunities for accomplishment and recognition. Children who joined experienced hiking trips, camping expeditions, sports competitions, theatrical performances, all activities that created real bonds of friendship and shared experience. These positive emotions became associated with the symbols and narratives of the organization, so that loyalty to the ideology felt like loyalty to one's friends, like protecting precious memories, like defending what had given life meaning and joy. This emotional binding was reinforced through ceremonial rituals that marked important transitions. Joining the organization, receiving promotions within its hierarchy, participating in mass rallies where thousands of young people moved as one, sang as one, demonstrated physical proof of their collective power. These ceremonies created peak emotional experiences, moments of transcendence where individual identity dissolved into something larger, where the ordinary constraints and loneliness of selfhood were temporarily overcome. The memory of these moments became a kind of psychological anchor, a reference point that pulled individuals back toward the ideology even when rational arguments might push them away. But across the Atlantic, a different kind of operation was unfolding, one that would prove even more sophisticated precisely because it never appeared to be indoctrination at all. In America, the manufacturing of patriotic belief took forms that felt voluntary, that seemed to emerge naturally from the culture rather than being imposed by the state. This made it more powerful, more resistant to critique, more capable of surviving across generations without the need for authoritarian enforcement. The American system understood something that totalitarian regimes often missed, that the most effective indoctrination is the kind that people embrace willingly, that feels like personal choice rather than state mandate, that allows individuals to believe they are thinking freely even as they absorb precisely the messages the system needs them to internalize. The genius of American patriotic conditioning was that it operated through mechanisms that appeared democratic, voluntary, even subversive of authority, while actually producing conformity more complete than any dictator could command. American schools in the 1940s and 50s began each day with a Pledge of Allegiance, a ritual so normalized that few questioned its function as daily ideological reinforcement. Children as young as 5 learned to stand, place hand over heart, and recite their loyalty to the nation before they could fully understand what the words meant. The ritual was presented not as state-mandated indoctrination but as a natural expression of gratitude, as voluntary participation in a shared civic culture. Yet the effect was identical to the morning salutes in Berlin or Moscow, the daily programming of automatic loyalty, the fusion of individual identity with national purpose, the normalization of pledging allegiance before conscious thought could question what that allegiance might require. The difference was in the framing. German children were told they served the Führer, Soviet children served the party, but American children were told they served an ideal: freedom, democracy, liberty. These abstract concepts proved far more powerful than concrete leaders because they were impossible to contradict or outgrow. A leader could be exposed as flawed, a party could be shown to be corrupt, but freedom and democracy remained pure, untouchable, always worthy of defense no matter what actions were taken in their names. American radio programming during World War II and the Cold War era created a mythology of American exceptionalism that penetrated every level of consciousness. Programs like The Adventures of Superman began each episode with the hero fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, fusing these concepts so that defending America became synonymous with defending truth itself. Questioning American policy became equivalent to opposing justice. Children absorbed these equations without recognizing them as ideological construction, without understanding that truth and justice were being defined in specifically American terms, that the American way was being presented as universal virtue rather than particular interest. The genius of these programs was that they entertained while they indoctrinated, that they provided genuine excitement and drama while embedding deeper lessons about authority, power, and who deserved protection. The heroes were always powerful individuals who operated outside democratic oversight, who made decisions unilaterally, who used violence to solve problems, but who were presented as defenders of democracy precisely because they fought for America. The contradiction was invisible to young viewers, who learned that democracy meant trusting powerful individuals to make decisions for the collective good, that freedom meant having heroes strong enough to impose order, that American values required unquestioning support for American power. Hollywood amplified these messages through films that presented American history as a story of inevitable progress and moral superiority. Westerns taught that frontier violence was justified, even noble, when performed by the right people in service of civilization. War films presented every American conflict as necessary, every American soldier as heroic, every enemy as either evil or misguided. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated, using music, cinematography, and narrative structure to create visceral responses that bypassed rational analysis. Children watching these films learned to feel pride when they saw the American flag, to feel righteous anger toward America's enemies, to feel that sacrificing oneself for the nation was the highest form of virtue. What made the American system particularly effective was its ability to incorporate dissent and rebellion into the patriotic narrative. Teenagers who felt alienated by mainstream culture could embrace rock and roll, could adopt rebellious styles and attitudes, could feel themselves resisting conformity, all while remaining firmly within the boundaries of acceptable American identity. The rebellion was always individual, never collective, always about personal expression rather than structural critique, always ultimately compatible with and even supportive of American capitalism and power. The system absorbed opposition, made it part of the culture, neutralized its radical potential while making people feel they were thinking freely, choosing independently, resisting rather than conforming. American schools during the Cold War taught that America represented freedom while the Soviet Union represented slavery, that capitalism was natural and democratic while communism was artificial and totalitarian, that American foreign policy was defensive and moral while Soviet expansion was aggressive and evil. These lessons were taught not just in explicit civics classes but woven throughout the curriculum, in history classes that presented American expansion as manifest destiny rather than imperial conquest, in literature classes that elevated American authors and American themes, in science classes that emphasized American technological achievement as proof of systemic superiority. The duck and cover drills of the 1950s functioned as powerful conditioning mechanisms, teaching children that nuclear war was survivable if they followed instructions, that the threat was external rather than a consequence of policy choices, that preparing for atomic attack was a normal part of childhood rather than an indication of catastrophic failure in adult leadership. The drills normalized permanent crisis, created a generation that accepted existential dread as the background condition of existence, that learned to trust authority to protect them from threats too large and complex for individual comprehension. American youth organizations like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts operated with less obvious ideological content than Hitler Youth or Young Pioneers, but they performed similar functions in shaping consciousness and programming loyalty. The emphasis on hierarchy, on earning recognition through demonstrated competence, on outdoor activities that built physical courage and self-reliance, all served to create citizens who valued individual achievement within collective structure, who respected authority, who saw themselves as part of a tradition larger than themselves. The oath to be physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight established clear categories of acceptable and unacceptable identity, defining what counted as strength, what counted as moral, what kind of awareness was valued and what kind was dangerous. The informal mechanisms were perhaps even more powerful than the formal ones. American consumer culture taught that freedom meant choice, that democracy meant access to products, that the American way of life was defined by material abundance and individual consumption. Children growing up in this environment learned to equate political freedom with economic freedom, to see capitalism not as an economic system but as the foundation of liberty itself, to believe that any threat to American economic power was a threat to freedom everywhere. These lessons were never stated explicitly in most cases, were never presented as ideology, but emerged naturally from the daily experience of living in American consumer society, from the constant exposure to advertising and entertainment that celebrated consumption as virtue and abundance as evidence of moral superiority. Comic books played a crucial role in American youth indoctrination, particularly during World War II and the Cold War. Captain America literally wrapped himself in the flag, his entire identity built around the idea that American values were worth fighting for, that enemies of America were enemies of goodness itself. The villains were often explicitly foreign, marked by accents and appearances that coded them as other, as outside the community that deserved protection and sympathy. Children reading these comics learned to identify with American power, to see violence in defense of America as heroic, to understand global conflict through a framework where America was always the protagonist, always justified, always ultimately in the right. The sophistication of American patriotic indoctrination lay in its ability to appear natural, to seem like the absence of indoctrination rather than its most refined form. Because the messages were delivered through commercial entertainment rather than state propaganda, because they were mixed with genuine creativity and artistic achievement, because they allowed for surface-level diversity and debate while maintaining core ideological boundaries. They seemed like free expression rather than controlled messaging. This made them far more powerful than crude propaganda could ever be, because the targets never recognized they were targets, never developed the psychological defenses that obvious propaganda triggers, never questioned the messages because the messages felt like their own thoughts, their own values, their own freely chosen beliefs. American children learned that their country was exceptional, that it had been founded on universal principles, that it had a special responsibility to spread freedom and democracy to the rest of the world. They learned this in school, in church, through entertainment, through casual conversations with adults who had themselves absorbed these beliefs and transmitted them unconsciously. The historical reality, the violence and exploitation that built American power, the gap between declared values and actual practice, were not exactly hidden but were framed as exceptions, as mistakes on the path toward a fundamentally just system, as evidence that America needed to live up to its ideals rather than evidence that the ideals themselves were propaganda. The McCarthy era demonstrated how effectively this conditioning had worked, how completely the boundaries of acceptable thought had been established. Americans who expressed sympathy for socialism or questioned American foreign policy were not just politically opposed but morally suspect, potentially traitorous, outside the community of legitimate citizens. The persecution of dissidents was not imposed by an authoritarian state but supported by popular consensus, by citizens who genuinely believed that defending American power was the same as defending freedom, who saw no contradiction in destroying lives and careers in the name of liberty. American military recruitment materials targeted at teenagers employed increasingly sophisticated psychological techniques, understanding exactly what emotional needs and desires could be exploited. The promise was not just service but transformation, not just duty but becoming, the idea that the military would make you into something better, stronger, more worthy of respect. The ads showed technology, adventure, camaraderie, all the things adolescents craved, while carefully avoiding images of actual combat, actual injury, actual death. The military was presented as the ultimate rite of passage, the place where boys became men, where individual potential was realized through collective service. The mythology of the greatest generation that emerged after World War II created a template that subsequent generations were expected to match, a standard of sacrifice and service that made questioning military action seem like personal failure, like inability to measure up to the heroism of one's grandparents. Children growing up in the shadow of this mythology absorbed the lesson that war could be good, that it could bring out the best in people, that military service was how you proved yourself worthy of the freedom you inherited. The complexity of war, the trauma and moral ambiguity, the reality that many veterans struggled for decades with what they had experienced, all this was smoothed over in favor of a narrative that served the needs of state power, that made future wars easier to justify and future sacrifices easier to demand. The integration of military culture into American civilian life proceeded gradually but comprehensively. Military flyovers at sporting events, the constant public honoring of veterans, the social pressure to support our troops regardless of what those troops were ordered to do, all created an environment where military power was celebrated as the foundation of freedom rather than examined as a political choice with costs and consequences. Children growing up in this environment learned that patriotism meant supporting the military unquestioningly, that freedom was something provided by soldiers rather than something negotiated through democratic process, that the proper response to military action was gratitude rather than scrutiny. The long-term psychological effects were devastating and permanent for many. Children raised in these systems had their critical faculties systematically suppressed during the precise developmental period when those faculties should have been strengthening. They learned to distrust their own perceptions if those perceptions contradicted authority, to feel shame and fear when independent thoughts arose, to immediately translate any experience into the ideological framework they had been taught. By the time they reached adulthood, many had lost the capacity for genuine independent thought, not because they were stupid or weak but because the neural pathways that support critical analysis had never been properly developed, had been actively inhibited during the years when the brain was most plastic and impressionable. The ethical horror of this process lies precisely in its effectiveness. These were not crude attempts at brainwashing that left obvious psychological scars and invited resistance. These were sophisticated systems designed by people who understood human development, who knew how to shape consciousness without creating awareness of the shaping, who recognized that the most effective control is the kind that feels like freedom, like natural growth, like the simple process of education and maturation. Teachers genuinely believed they were helping children develop into capable, moral adults. Parents genuinely believed the schools and youth organizations were providing their children with structure, community, opportunities for growth. The children themselves experienced the lessons and activities as exciting, meaningful, validating. Almost no one involved recognized that they were participating in a vast operation of mental engineering, that belief was being manufactured with the same industrial precision as weapons and uniforms, that the human mind itself had become a battlefield where the real war was being fought and won. The operation succeeded because it was total, because it left no space untouched, no medium unused, no moment of a child's life free from ideological saturation. The lessons in school were reinforced by the programs on radio, which were reinforced by the images on posters, which were reinforced by the activities of youth organizations, which were reinforced by the expectations of parents, who had themselves been shaped by the same system or had learned to perform compliance to protect themselves and their families. There was no outside, no alternative perspective, no voice saying that perhaps the lessons were not truth but construction, that perhaps the categories were not natural but imposed, that perhaps the whole edifice was built on lies. Those few who did resist, who somehow maintained the capacity for independent thought despite the saturation, faced impossible choices. To voice doubts was to risk everything: education, career, family relationships, personal safety. The system was designed to make dissent not just dangerous but unintelligible, to create conditions where alternative views literally could not be articulated or even fully formed in consciousness. The language itself had been colonized, the words redefined, the concepts restructured so that expressing opposition required inventing new vocabulary, new frameworks, new ways of thinking that had no social support or validation. The children who grew up in these systems carried the effects for life. Even those who later encountered different ideas, who learned the history of what had been done to them, often found that the early conditioning remained active at a level below conscious thought. They would intellectually reject the ideology but still feel its emotional pull, still experience the world through categories it had established, still respond with conditioned reflexes when certain symbols or narratives appeared. The plasticity of the young brain, which made it so vulnerable to manipulation, also made the results of that manipulation extraordinarily resistant to reversal. Studies of survivors decades later revealed the depth of the damage. Many reported feeling that they had never developed a true self, that beneath the adult exterior was still a child following instructions, performing a role, repeating lessons learned so long ago that they felt like instinct. Some experienced profound identity crises when they finally recognized the extent to which they had been shaped, feeling that if they removed all the conditioning, nothing genuine would remain. Others simply never questioned, never looked back, continued to organize their lives around the same fundamental beliefs they had absorbed as children, passing them to the next generation with the same conviction their teachers had shown, perpetuating the cycle. The operations techniques did not die with the regimes that pioneered them. After the war, researchers studied the methods systematically, analyzed what had worked and what had not, extracted the underlying principles and refined them further. The knowledge spread, adapted, reappeared in new contexts with new justifications. Every government interested in stability and control recognized the value of shaping young minds, of establishing ideological foundations before critical thinking fully developed, of using schools and media to manufacture consensus on an industrial scale. Modern applications are more subtle, more deniable, but the core mechanism remains unchanged. Children are still exposed to thousands of hours of content designed to shape their beliefs, their values, their basic assumptions about reality. The content is delivered through schools, through screens, through every institution and medium that touches their lives. The messages are carefully calibrated, tested, refined based on psychological research and behavioral data. And the children absorb it all without recognizing it as indoctrination because it is presented as education, as entertainment, as the natural process of learning about the world. The distinction between education and indoctrination is not as clear as we might wish. All education involves shaping minds, instilling values, teaching certain frameworks for understanding reality while excluding others. The difference lies in degree, in purpose, in whether the system allows and encourages critical thinking or systematically suppresses it. Operation Puppet Mind and systems like it crossed that line decisively, creating mechanisms designed not to educate but to program, not to develop independent judgment but to manufacture obedience, not to prepare children for citizenship but to convert them into instruments of state power. The architects of these systems understood that controlling a population begins with controlling what that population can think, and that controlling thought requires starting before the capacity for critical analysis has fully formed. They understood that if you shape a child's fundamental categories, their basic assumptions, their emotional responses to symbols and narratives, you shape everything that follows. You create adults who believe they are thinking freely while following patterns established decades earlier, who defend the ideology not because they have examined and chosen it but because it is fused with their sense of self, with their deepest feelings of belonging and purpose. This is the secret science that Operation Puppet Mind represented. Not crude force or obvious coercion but the patient, systematic, scientifically informed reshaping of consciousness itself. The operation succeeded not because it was mysterious but because it understood and exploited fundamental truths about human development, about how identity forms, about the relationship between emotion and belief, about the power of environment to shape what feels normal and what feels impossible. The files documenting this operation, scattered across multiple archives, were never meant to be assembled into a coherent picture. Each piece seems innocuous in isolation: a curriculum guideline, a radio production schedule, a poster design brief, a Hollywood script approved by military advisors, a textbook chapter celebrating American expansion. Only when combined do they reveal the scope and sophistication of what was actually constructed, the cold precision with which human consciousness was treated as raw material to be processed and shaped according to specifications determined by those in power. The children who were processed through this system, who had their minds methodically molded during the most vulnerable years of development, became the adults who committed atrocities, who followed orders that violated every principle of human decency, who participated in industrial-scale horror without apparent remorse or doubt. But they also became the adults who believed themselves free, who defended their systems as democratic and open, who genuinely could not see the bars of the cage because they had been raised inside it, because the cage was built from ideas that felt like their own thoughts, values that felt like personal conviction, beliefs that felt like obvious truth. The real horror is not that such a system existed but that it worked, that human minds proved to be exactly as malleable as the designers hoped, that consciousness itself could be shaped with the same reliability as metal or wood. And the deepest horror is that the knowledge gained from these operations was not buried with the regimes that employed them but preserved, studied, refined, and deployed again in new forms, with better technology, with more sophisticated understanding, with methods so subtle that their targets never realize they are being shaped. Every belief you hold, every value you defend, every assumption you make about reality was formed during those same vulnerable years, through systems that may have been less extreme but that employed the same basic techniques. Repetition, authority, peer pressure, emotional association, environmental saturation. The question is not whether you were shaped but by whom, for what purpose, with what degree of awareness and consent. Operation Puppet Mind was never officially declassified because it was never officially classified. It existed in plain sight, in schools and on radio and on posters, in youth organizations and family rituals and daily routines, in movie theaters and on television screens and in comic books. It was invisible not because it was hidden but because it was everywhere, normalized, accepted as the natural process of raising children and preparing them for adult life. Only in retrospect, only by tracing the patterns and understanding the purposes, does the operation become visible as what it truly was. The industrial-scale manufacture of human consciousness, the conversion of young minds into ammunition for wars that would be fought in reality and in ideology, in battlefields and in the deepest structures of belief. The children in those classrooms, listening to those radios, walking past those posters, watching those films, reading those comics had no way of knowing that they were not simply learning but being constructed, that their thoughts were not their own but products of an engineering process, that the beliefs they would carry for life were being installed with the precision of machine parts in an assembly. They trusted the adults around them, trusted the institutions that claimed to be educating and protecting them. That trust was weaponized, converted into a mechanism for control more effective than any physical force could ever be. The lesson from Operation Puppet Mind is not that indoctrination is possible but that it is routine, not that minds can be controlled but that they are controlled, not that propaganda works but that it is the foundation of social order, and that those who believe themselves immune to its effects are precisely those on whom it has worked most completely. The operation never ended, it simply evolved, adapted, became so normalized that questioning it feels paranoid, dangerous, like something only a defective mind would do. The most effective systems are those that make people believe they are free while controlling the boundaries of what they can imagine, what they can question, what they can become. American children were taught they lived in the land of the free, and they believed it absolutely, even as their thoughts were shaped, their beliefs manufactured, their identities constructed according to specifications designed to serve state power and economic interest. The contradiction was invisible because the conditioning was complete, because it had begun before memory, because it felt like nature rather than construction. If you have listened this far, you already know too much. You have seen how belief is manufactured, how minds are shaped, how the war for consciousness is fought and won long before anyone realizes there is a battle. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, the most dangerous lie is the one that feels like truth, the most effective control is the one that feels like freedom, and the deepest programming is the one installed so early that it feels like self. Question what you were taught. Question who taught you. Question why you believe what you cannot remember learning. The puppets never see their strings until someone teaches them to look up.